It's prohibited. Almost all, there are an enormous number of innocent victims now. You've got the people who are, whose purses are stolen, who are bashed over the head by people trying to get enough money for their next fix. You've got the people killed in the random drug wars. You've got the corruption of the legal establishment. You've got the innocent victims of the taxpayers who have to pay for more and more prisons and more prisoners and more policemen. You've got the rest of us who don't get decent law enforcement because all the law enforcement officials are busy trying to do the impossible problem. And, not last but not least, you've got the people of Colombia and Peru and so on. What business do we have destroying and leading to the killing of thousands of people in Colombia because we cannot enforce our own laws? If we could enforce our laws against drugs, there would be no market for these drugs. You wouldn't have Colombia in the state it's in.
In a very important sense, is it not true that the entire discussion here, the entire drug problem, is an economic problem?
No, it's not an economic problem at all. It's a moral problem.
In what way?
The economics part of it is, I'm an economist, but the economics problem is strictly tertiary. It's a moral problem. It's a problem of the harm which government is doing. Look, I have estimated statistically that the prohibition of drugs produces, on the average, 10,000 additional homicides a year. It's a moral problem that the government is going around killing 10,000 people. It's a moral problem that the government is making into criminals people who may be doing something you and I don't approve of, but who are doing something that hurts nobody else. Most of the arrests for drugs are for possession by casual users. Now here's somebody who wants to smoke a cigarette, a joint, a marijuana cigarette. If he's caught, he goes to jail. Now, is that moral? Is that proper? I think it's absolutely disgraceful that our government, supposed to be our government, should be in the position of converting people who are not harming others into criminals, of destroying their life, putting them in jail. I don't see, that's the issue to me. The economic issue is strictly, the economic issue comes in only for explaining why it has those effects. But the economics reasons are not the reasons. Of course we're wasting money on it.
There are
10,
many...
20, $30 billion a year. But that's trivial. We're wasting that much money in many other ways, such as buying up crops that ought never to be produced.
There are many who would look at the economics from the standpoint of looking at how the economics of the drug business is affecting America's major inner cities, for example.
Of course it is, and it is because it's prohibited. It's the government. See, the role of the government, if you look at it from a purely economic point of view, the role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. That's literally true.
Is it doing a good job with it?
Excellent. What do I mean by that? In an ordinary free market business, let's take potatoes, beef, anything you want, there are thousands of importers and exporters. Anybody can go into the business. But the drug, but it's very hard for a small person to go into the drug importing business because our interdiction efforts essentially make it enormously costly. So the only people who can survive in that business are these large meddling cartel kind of people who have enough money so they can have fleets of airplanes, so they can have sophisticated methods, so on. So in effect, in addition to which, by keeping goods out, by arresting, let's say, local marijuana growers, the government keeps the price of these products high. So what more could a monopolist want? He's got a government who makes it very hard for all his competitors and who keeps the price of his product high. It's absolutely heaven.
Of course, you know that there are conspiracy theorists who suggest it's there for a reason, and that's because governments are in cahoots with the drug traffickers. You wouldn't say that.
I don't say that at all. You know, over and over again in government policy, good intentions go awry. And the reason good intentions go awry is because you're spending somebody else's money.
Many would say that a lot of your theories are grounded in the notion of personal interest, that it's in individuals, if it is in an individual's personal interest to do something, he or she will do that.
Absolutely. That's not a theory.
As you know, some people would say that...
That's not a theory. There's nobody who will deny it.
Okay.
Is there anybody who will deny that you can expect every person to pursue his own personal interest? Now, those personal interests don't have to be narrow. Mother Teresa is pursuing her own personal interest just as much as as Donald Trump is pursuing his. But they're both pursuing their personal interest.
Some would say that that notion that personal interest is what propels societies as well as people is a heartless philosophy, and that the underclass would not fare well under that kind of a notion. You've heard that before.
Yes, of course, but the evidence is so overwhelming. The only countries in the world in which low-income people have managed to get a halfway decent level of living are those which rely on capitalist markets. Just compare the quality of life, the level of living of the ordinary people in Russia and the ordinary people in, I won't say the United States, but in France, in Italy, in Germany, in England, or in Hong Kong. Compare Hong Kong with mainland China. Hong Kong, the question is, every society is driven by personal interest. Mainland China is driven by personal interest. The question is, how is personal interest disciplined? Mm-hmm. If the only way you can satisfy your personal interest is by getting somebody that other people want to pay for,
or by forcing it down other people's throats at the point of a gun, I suppose.
If you can do it at the extreme, but that won't get their cooperation. You may be able to kill them. You may be able to take their wealth, but it won't create any more wealth. So the only societies which have been able to create broadly based relative prosperity have been those societies which have relied primarily on capitalist markets. That's true whether you take Hong Kong versus mainland China, East Germany versus West Germany, Czechoslovakia before World War II and currently. You cannot find a single exception to that proposition. So that Adam Smith put it best over 200 years ago when he said, the pursuit of people who intend only to pursue their self-interest are led by an invisible hand to promote the public interest, even though that was no part of their intention. Mr. Ford did not develop the Ford car for the public interest. He did it for his private interest.
But Adam Smith also saw a role for government. He also saw, for example, in the administration of justice, didn't he?
So do I. I am not a zero government person. I think there is a real role of government, and one of the reasons I object to so many of the things that government has gotten into is that it prevents government from performing its proper role. But here, a basic role of government is to keep you from having your house burgled, to keep you from being hit over the head. And because so large a fraction of our law enforcement machinery is devoted to the war on drugs, you haven't got that kind of safety.
But of course, there is clearly the argument that if the police come and pick up a person who is addicted to a drug and does not have the money to buy those drugs, then they're also taking a potential burglar off the street who's going to come and get my house, right?
They are, but there'll be more of them coming on, as we know. And besides, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to house them? Half of all those, or more than half, a majority of those people who are arrested are simply arrested for possession. They're casual users. The people who really create the havoc on the streets are as much the people engaged in the drug war. And they're engaged in the drug war only because it's illegal. It's a repeat of prohibition.
Let us turn in the final few minutes then to specifically what your vision is then. Under your system, if you could make a wish and have it come true, what system would that be? How would you legalize drugs? How would you go about doing that?
I would legalize drugs by subjecting them to exactly the same rules that alcohol and cigarettes are subjected to now. Alcohol and cigarettes cause more deaths than drugs do by far. From use, but many fewer innocent victims. The major innocent victims in that case are the people who are killed by drunk drivers. And we ought to enforce a law against drunk driving, just as we ought to enforce a law against driving under the influence of marijuana or cocaine or anything else. But I would, as a first step at least, treat the drugs exactly the way we now treat alcohol and tobacco, no different.
You know what Representative Charles Rangel would say?
Charles Rangel, I have heard Charles Rangel. He's a demagogue who had no relationship between what he says and the interests of his own constituents. His own constituents, the people he served, are among the people who would be benefited the most by legalization of drugs.
I say that only because
Rangel is pursuing his own self-interest.
Forgive me for throwing out a name, but I just wanted to mention one typical response to that would be that If you treat it like alcohol, you're talking about full-page ads in magazines with cocaine. You're talking about television advertisers. You're talking about buying cocaine at the ballpark.
I beg your pardon. Television advertising is forbidden today for alcohol.
For hard liquor. That's true.
For hard liquor. And I say treat this the same way as you would treat alcohol. So presumably such ads would be forbidden for this. But of course, in any event, I'm not prohibiting anybody from reading Mr. Rangel, and his ideas are at least as dangerous as those full-page ads you're talking about.
What scares you the most about the notion of drugs being legal as
Nothing
like
scares
alcohol?
me about the notion of drugs being legal.
Nothing.
What scares me is a notion of continuing on the path we're on now, which will destroy our free society, making it an uncivilized place. There's only one way you can really enforce the drug laws currently. The only way to do it is to adopt the policies of Saudi Arabia, Singapore, some other countries adopt, in which a drug addict is subject to capital punishment, or at the very least having his hand chopped off. If we were willing to use penalties like that, but would that be a society you'd want to live in?
Last question. You have grandchildren?
Absolutely.
You have a 2-year-old granddaughter?
Yes.
And her name is?
Her name is Becca.
Becca. When you look at Becca, what do you see for her and for her future?
That depends entirely on what you and your fellow citizens do to our country. If you and your fellow citizens continue on moving more and more in the direction of socialism, not only inspired through your drug prohibition, but through the socialization of schools, the socialization of medicine, the regulation of industry, I see for my granddaughter the equivalent of Soviet communism 3 years ago.
You firmly believe that drugs in this country should be legalized?
What have we been talking about for a half an hour?
I say that as a concluding statement to just simply say in conclusion that we have heard for the past half hour exactly why Professor Friedman believes that drugs should be legal in this country. Are there good reasons? You be the judge. I'm Randy Page in Washington. Thanks for joining us.